This is Eon History. Tonight, a chapter from A Night in Alexandria, the quiet hours in the library. Settle in. The light is low, the hour is long. In the royal quarter of Alexandria, where the sea air moved in from the Great Harbour and the Pharos shone white over black water, the library kept its quieter hours after dusk. Lamps burned with a patient yellow flame inside the Mouseion, and the smell of papyrus, cedar oil, and warm plaster rested in the colonnades. Beyond the palace walls, rigging clicked softly against masts, and the brine of the harbor mixed with the sweeter dust of scroll rooms. It was likely in such hours, when the city had not fully slept but had lowered its voice, that Alexandria most resembled the thought it had been built to serve. The great library was never only a room of books, and perhaps not even a single building in the way later centuries preferred to imagine it. The evidence suggests an institution joined to the Mouseion, the shrine of the Muses, within the long royal precinct known as the Brucheion. Strabo, visiting Alexandria in the age of Augustus, described the Mouseion as part of the royal palaces, with a public walk, an exedra furnished with seats, and a large house for the common meals of learned men. He did not pause to describe shelves or cupboards, perhaps because the scholars around him needed no explanation of what the place contained. In his calm, compressed lines, there was already a world of white colonnades, garden shadows, lecture seats cooling after sunset, and rooms where rolled papyrus waited in ordered abundance. That world had been planned from the beginning as a conversation between kingship and knowledge. Alexandria itself had been placed between sea and lake, between the open Mediterranean and the slower inland waters of Mareotis, where the air was washed on both sides and summer winds moved through streets broader than many cities could afford. The Ptolemies, who ruled Egypt after Alexander, made their capital not only a seat of power but a net cast across language, memory, and prestige. A library in that setting was no ornament. It was an argument. It declared that empire could gather not only tribute and soldiers, but texts, commentaries, maps, plays, calendars, and measures of the world. One of the earliest voices linked to the library came from the letter of Aristeas, a difficult source and not one to be trusted in every detail. Even so, it preserved a memorable ambition. It set Demetrius of Phalerum, the keeper of the king's library, collecting, if possible, all the books in the inhabited earth. The phrase carried the bright excess of the Hellenistic age. It is likely that no one, not even the Ptolemies, imagined literally everything written by every people. Yet the ambition was real enough to shape policy, patronage, and the daily labor of acquisition. In Aristeas, Demetrius spoke of more than 200,000 books already assembled, with the hope of reaching 500,000. These numbers were almost certainly counts of scrolls, not bound books in the modern sense, and ancient figures rose and fell with rhetoric. Still, even the lower estimates suggested a collection large enough to require catalogues, copyists, storage rooms, and long habits of care. Such habits had their own sound. In the later evening, after petitioners had withdrawn and the ceremonial pulse of the palace had softened, the Mouseion would have been filled less by speech than by small, repeated motions. A reed pen touched a fresh surface, a knife trimmed a frayed edge, a wooden tag clicked against a shelf. Sand was shaken over wet ink. Fabric curtains breathed faintly in the harbor wind. The very material of Alexandrian scholarship invited quiet. Papyrus did not reward haste. One handled it with dry fingers and steady wrists, lifting the roll, loosening the tie, turning it with the practiced movement that kept fibers from splitting under strain. The library's calm was not merely atmosphere, it was technique. The Ptolemies pursued books with methods later ages remembered as half admirable and half predatory. Galen, writing centuries after the first founders, repeated a story that became famous for good reason. According to him, books found on ships entering Alexandria were taken, copied by official scribes, and the copies returned to their owners while the originals were kept, marked as volumes from the ships. Whether Galen described an unbroken administrative practice or unembellished memory of royal appetite remains debated, and modern scholars have urged caution. Yet the detail of the label, so dry and bureaucratic, rings with a strange plausibility. One could almost see it in lamp glow, a little note of origin attached to a text that had crossed dark water and entered the king's keeping. Another tale, preserved through Galen and other later writers, told of Ptolemy III borrowing the official Athenian copies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. He was said to have lodged 15 talents as security, sent back exquisite copies on fine material, and calmly kept the originals. The story may have sharpened with retelling, but it preserved something essential about Alexandrian priorities. The library did not merely want texts, it wanted the best texts, the earliest texts, the most authoritative forms. The difference mattered. A drama known from a careless copy was not the same as a drama copied from the city archive itself. In the quiet hours, therefore, Alexandria's scholars were not only reading, they were weighing variants, comparing lines, deciding which word belonged and which had drifted in from the fatigue of a copyist or the vanity of a performer. No figure embodied that more deeply than Callimachus, though much of his great catalogue was later lost. His Pinaques, or tables, was said to have filled 120 books of its own. That was not a shelf list in the modern sense. It was a vast ordering of authors, genres, openings, attributions, and notes, a map of literature built inside literature. Less often noted is the quiet revolutionary force of such work. The catalogue did not only help one find a role, it reshaped the meaning of possession. To name, classify, and compare a text was to bring it under a new kind of rule, gentler than conquest, but no less lasting. When lamps burned late in Alexandria, it was often because empire had discovered that knowledge became more powerful when sorted. The men who worked there were not a single breed. Poets, grammarians, astronomers, physicians, geographers, and textual critics moved through the same precinct with different rhythms of thought. Zenodotus labored over Homer. Eratosthenes measured the earth from reports, shadows, and distance. Aristarchus refined the language of epic with a severity later ages almost feared. The dining hall of the Mouseion, where scholars ate in common, must have carried the warm smell of bread, oil, and wine into the academic night. One may picture folded garments brushing stone benches, a low murmur in Greek, the rustle of a scroll, unrolled even during supper, and beyond an arcade the salt breath of the harbor entering the garden dark. The city outside answered in its own registers. Alexandria by night was not silent, but its sounds tended to layer rather than strike. Water moved at the quay. Somewhere a bronze latch fell closed. Donkeys passed under burdens from the lake port. The Pharos fire was tended in its tower. In workshops nearer the commercial districts, late lamps still shone over glass, bronze, or linen. Yet the royal quarter could withdraw from that labor while still feeding on it. Scrolls arrived because ships arrived. Scholars read because merchants unloaded cedar chests and rope-sealed bundles. The library's serenity rested in part on the ceaseless movement of one of the ancient Mediterranean's busiest ports. This was one of Alexandria's quieter truths, and not always the one preserved in romantic memory. A library of this scale depended not on isolated genius alone, but on logistics. Papyrus had to be cut, pressed, dried, and sold. Ink had to be mixed. Scribes had to be paid, housed, and trained. Copies had to be checked against exemplars. Rooms had to stay dry enough for survival, airy enough against rot, and guarded enough against theft. The evidence suggests a city where administration and scholarship lived unusually close together. In one direction stood the palace and treasury, in another the harbor warehouses. Between them sat those long, careful nights in which thought took form on rolled reed paper. Less often noted, too, is how much of Alexandria's greatness lay in repeated acts of correction. The library inherited texts that had traveled through performance, recitation, private copying, and neglect. To stabilize them required not only learning but patience, almost monastic in temper, though the age had no monastery yet to name it. A critic in the library might read a familiar line of Homer and pause over one adjective as if touching a cracked cup in the dark. Another might compare two copies of a historian and mark a discrepancy no louder than a breath. We believe much of the library's authority came from this humble persistence. Its fame was imperial, but its labor was minute. The night, therefore, suited it. Daylight belonged more fully to embassies, royal audiences, instruction, and movement through the public walk. Evening belonged to slower attention. Oil lamps made one read within a smaller pool of sight, and in that narrowing there was a kind of discipline. Faces withdrew into softness beyond the flame. Painted walls lost their brilliance. Marble kept only a faint milk-like glow. A scholar's hand, the edge of a roll, and a line of script became the whole visible world for several quiet hours. It is easy to imagine that the library loved such conditions, though the surviving texts do not speak in that way. Still, the physical facts of night did part of the librarian's work. They reduced distraction and made the page a hearth. This was the before, and for a long time it seemed durable. Yet the library's history was not the tale of a single perfect age ending in a single catastrophe. The sources disagreed, later memories embroidered, and politics often bent the story into a usable legend. Even in antiquity, there were several Alexandrian libraries, or at least several collections linked by function and prestige. There was the library within the royal quarter, joined in some manner to the Mouseion. There was also the collection associated with the Serapeum, the great sanctuary of Serapis in the western part of the city. What changed over generations was not simply whether a library stood or burned, but where the city's intellectual weight settled, and under whose protection books could still breathe. The famous turning point came in the Alexandrian War, when Julius Caesar found himself entangled in the dynastic struggle between Cleopatra and her brother. Ancient writers did not give a single, simple account. Caesar himself spoke of the fighting, but not of any library destroyed. Seneca later mentioned the loss of 40,000 books. Plutarch, writing still later, said that the fire spread and consumed the great library. Cassius Dio described dockyards and storehouses of grain and books burning in great number. Modern scholars have therefore been careful. The evidence now suggests that the fire of 48 BCE may have damaged books stored near the harbor, perhaps in warehouses, rather than annihilating the entire institution at once. That quieter, less theatrical reading fits an important fact. Strabo still found the Mouseion standing in the age of Augustus. This mattered for the feel of Alexandria after Caesar. The city did not wake the next morning to intellectual emptiness. It continued. Scrolls remained. Scholars remained. The great critic Didymus, prodigiously productive and almost absurdly industrious, belonged to the generations after the war, and his very existence implied a scholarly environment not wholly extinguished. Yet something had shifted. Once a fire touched stored books, once civil war entered the royal quarter, once the authority of the Ptolemies gave way to Roman rule, the library's place in the city could no longer be what it had been. The smell of charred timber may not have reached every room of the Mouseion, but the political weather had changed. Under Rome, Alexandria remained brilliant, learned, and often restless. Its harbors stayed busy, its schools influential, its streets argumentative. But the old alignment of crown and collection was altered. Strabo's brief notice of the museum included a small but revealing detail. The priest in charge, he said, had once been appointed by the kings and was now appointed by Caesar. That sentence was administrative in tone, almost weightless, and yet in it lay a new order. The House of the Muses had passed from Hellenistic dynasty into imperial oversight. Lamps still burned, meals were still taken in common, books were still read, but the patronage that framed the night had acquired a Roman seal. There was another, subtler change as well. Collections survived not only by fame but by copying. Papyrus was mortal. A scroll neglected, even in fair conditions, would slowly betray its fibers. The true enemy of ancient books was not always flame. Often it was interval. A text unread might go uncopied. A commentary no longer fashionable might remain in one or two rolls only. Then in none. Thus the library's decline, where decline occurred, may have been less like a thunderclap and more like a lamp deprived of oil, one careful spoonful at a time. A drama remained on the shelf but was no longer requested. A scientific treatise was cited by one scholar and not by the next. A room was repaired more slowly than before. A cupboard stayed closed through an entire season. By the 2nd century, the Serapeum rose with increasing importance in the imagination of the city. The temple itself, standing high above the old district of Rakotis, looked over Alexandria with the confidence of a height made sacred by both architecture and use. Recent scholarship has argued, carefully and not without debate, that by the later Roman period, the Serapeum may have housed Alexandria's principal surviving library collection. This reading draws strength from the changed pattern of sources and from the fate of the royal quarter, repeatedly disturbed by imperial conflict. If so, the quiet hours of Alexandria's library would, in time, have migrated westward and upward, from palace adjacency to temple enclosure. That possibility gained force from a remarkable description preserved under the name of Aphtonius. Writing in late antiquity, he described the Serapeum as a place of broad colonnades, a great courtyard, and smaller structures built inside the stoa. Some of these, he said, were reading rooms for books, giving the studious a chance to pursue wisdom. It was a passing note within a rhetorical exercise, and therefore all the more valuable. It suggested not a legendary storehouse beyond imagination, but a lived complex where learning had rooms, benches, thresholds, and shade. One could move through it. One could sit in it. One could read there while light slipped down the columns and the stone released the day's gathered heat back into the evening air. The afterlife of the library, then, was not pure disappearance, but relocation, adaptation, and thinning. The evidence suggests a city learning to carry its intellectual habits through political damage. Under emperors, through riots, fiscal changes, and alterations in cult, Alexandrians did what literate cities often do. They kept copying what still seemed worth copying. They taught in rooms available to them. They moved books when they had to. Recent archaeological work in Alexandria's eastern harbor has traced sunken edges of the old royal quarter and helped scholars refine the topography of the Basileia, reminding us how much of the early city lay vulnerable to sea, subsidence, and later rebuilding. At the same time, excavations in the Mouseion zone have yielded the dense, ordinary residues of habitation and administration rather than a neat monumental label reading library. The quieter truth beside the legend is that Alexandria has survived in pieces, and its greatest institution is known through dispersed traces more than through one triumphant ruin. There is a tenderness in that. The ancient city, especially after midnight, would have seemed solid enough to those who lived within it. The walls stood, the sea broke and withdrew, temple lamps burned in bronze cups. Yet the modern search for the library has often found layers, foundations, filled trenches, reused stone, and shifted coastlines. The great certainty of the past has become the careful uncertainty of archaeology. We believe this does not diminish Alexandria. It restores something human to it. The library was never magic-made architecture. It was a worked place in a changing city, and changing cities rarely leave their most delicate institutions intact. As the centuries moved on, the texture of learned life in Alexandria softened and spread. The city remained a center for medicine, philosophy, rhetoric, and biblical scholarship. Not all of this belonged to the old library, but much belonged to the same long habit of reading, excerpting, and teaching. The late antique auditoria found at Com el Dica, with their rows of seats and disciplined classroom form, were built long after the first Ptolemies. They remind us that Alexandria's educational life outlasted the age of its founding legend. Even after the brightest phase of the Mouseion had passed, the city still knew how to gather students under stone vaults and let a voice carry across a room while dust drifted in afternoon light. Yet night changed as the city's religious world changed. The old gods did not vanish in a moment, but their precincts grew less secure. Serapis, once one of Alexandria's great civic powers, continued to command devotion, healing hopes, and ceremony. Incubation rites, in which the faithful slept in sacred space awaiting dreams or cures, belonged to this atmosphere of low lamps and expectant darkness. A sanctuary like the Serapeum therefore held its own kind of night knowledge, different from but not opposed to scholarly night. There were reading rooms, if Aphtonius can be trusted. There were also pilgrims, priests, votive habits, and temple rhythms. The library, if housed there, would have existed beside incense, procession, and the slow breathing of supplicants asleep on stone or woven mats. This mingling of functions was not unusual in antiquity. Knowledge did not live in sharply modern categories. A temple could house books. A physician could be philosopher and editor. A grammarian might serve under royal patronage and dine in a sacred precinct. The more one lingered with Alexandria, the less it resembled the clean diagrams of later textbooks. It was humid, ceremonial, commercial, argumentative, multilingual, and full of repeated acts of filing, copying, and prayer. At night, the categories blended further. The same lamp that lit a sacred image could light a shelf. The same hand that tied a papyrus roll might later raise a cup in a communal meal or pinch incense over embers. Then came the harder shift, the one after which the old quiet would no longer return in the same form. In 391 CE, amid the Christianization of the empire and the bitter urban tensions for which Alexandria was already notorious, the Serapeum was attacked and destroyed. The details in our sources were shaped by ideology and by proximity to violence. Christian writers emphasized the triumph over pagan cult. Pagan voices mourned desecration or spoke with a wounded reserve. Modern interpretation remained cautious, especially about whether a substantial library still existed there at that exact date. Yet recent scholarship has argued that the Serapeum's destruction likely involved the end of a book collection associated with the sanctuary, and that some later authors, speaking in muted or past-tense ways about its literary riches, reflected this loss. What mattered for the city's deeper rhythm was that a sanctuary long tied to memory, learning, and elevated civic identity had been broken. After that, the night in Alexandria altered. The high precinct that Aphtonius had described with its stoas and reading rooms no longer held those patterns of movement. The columns might cast their shadows for a while longer, but not over the same uses. Stones could remain after institutions had gone quiet. This is often how urban death feels. The first sign is not emptiness, but changed purpose. A passage still opens to the wind, yet no student enters. A bench remains smooth, yet no scroll is unrolled there. A courtyard still receives moonlight, yet the voices it was shaped to gather have fallen away. Orosius, visiting Alexandria in the early 5th century, wrote of seeing book cupboards in temples, though emptied in his own time. His testimony was late and his framing Christian, but the image lingered with peculiar force. Empty cupboards. The library's ending may have been less ablaze than that. Not a single apocalyptic furnace swallowing all thought, but cupboards from which rolls had been removed, neglected, dispersed, copied elsewhere, or lost without witness. The smell in such a room would have been dustier than before. Not the warm, organic scent of handled papyrus, but dry wood, plaster, and absence. A shelf without use took on the stillness of a sealed chamber. Even the flame of a lamp burned differently where no one read by it. This was the after, and it invites a gentler kind of mourning than legend allows. The Library of Alexandria became, in later memory, a symbol of all knowledge destroyed by one act of barbarism. That story was rhetorically useful and therefore often repeated. It gave history a villain, a pyre, and a clean, tragic line. The evidence resists that simplicity. Books were lost in several episodes, under several regimes, across several centuries. Some works vanished because they ceased to be copied. Some may have perished in harbor fires, some in war, some in temple destruction, and many in the ordinary erosion of transmission. The true sadness was longer, quieter, and perhaps more intimate. The world forgot by degrees. Still, the night in Alexandria never wholly ceased to be a night of books. Christian scholars read there, physicians taught there, copyists labored there under new patronage, new doctrine, and new textual priorities. The old Mouseion did not simply pass into a void. Its habits dissolved into successor forms, some grand, some modest, some visible only in manuscript traditions carried far from Egypt. A commentary preserved in Byzantium, a medical text surviving through Arabic translation, a biblical recension copied in monastic scriptoria centuries later, all carried something of Alexandrian discipline within them. The hearth moved, but the fire was not wholly lost. If one returned, then, to a single night and listened carefully, what would remain? Perhaps first, the sea. The sea endured every version of the city. It washed the moles and harbor walls in the age of the first Ptolemies, in Caesar's war, in the Roman centuries, and after the Serapeum's fall. It touched the eastern royal quarter, where underwater archaeology now finds stone beneath green water. It breathed salt into libraries, temples, palaces, and schools alike. The library's quiet hours were always maritime hours, too. Every scroll that arrived by ship carried a little of the harbor into the room, a smell of rope, tar, wet wood, and foreign dust. Then there was light. In the beginning, lamp flames fell across catalogues, glosses, and corrected lines of Homer. Later, they shone in temple reading rooms under the Serapeum's stoas. Later still, they burned in other halls, on other pages, under emblems no Ptolemaic king had imagined. Light was never innocent in Alexandria. It meant patronage, oil, labor, wakefulness, and the will to continue reading after sunset. When those supports weakened, the city darkened not all at once, but table by table, shelf by shelf. And there was the human breath of the readers themselves. They have almost all disappeared from the record except where a famous name held long enough to be recopied. Yet libraries are made less by the celebrated than by the persistent. Someone dusted shelves, someone mixed ink in a shallow vessel, someone carried a requested roll through a courtyard whose stones were cooling after heat. Someone retied a bundle and returned it to a niche. Someone paused in the night to hear gulls over the harbor, and then bent again to the page. Those lives did not become legend, and because they did not, they feel nearer. It is likely that no one in any given evening believed he stood near the end of the great library. Institutions do not announce their mortality to those inhabiting them. Even after damage, there are repairs. Even after confiscation, there are copies. Even after a fire, there are surviving shelves and hopeful administrators. A scholar in one of the later Alexandrian nights may have thought chiefly of the line before him, the fold in the papyrus, the scrape of a stool on stone, the hour before sleep. History later arranged such moments into thresholds, Those living them felt only weather, work, and the ordinary length of evening. Perhaps that is why Alexandria continues to rest so strongly in the imagination. It represented not only lost books, but the fragile dailiness by which books live at all. Its grandeur was real, yet its true life was made of repeated minor acts performed under low light. A library could aspire to gather the world and still depend on the unnoticed discipline of one careful hand. That paradox was the city's gift. It joined the imperial and the intimate, the harbor wide and the fingertip small. In the last stretch of night, after the arguments had ended and the teaching seats stood empty, the rooms themselves would have settled. Stone held the day's warmth in its deeper mass while the surface cooled. Wick smoke clung faintly in the air. Linen garments kept the smell of oil and sea salt. Outside, waves worked at the harbor steps, patient and unconcerned. Inside, a final roll might be tied shut and placed back among others already sleeping in their ranks. If the library still stood in the royal quarter, that act belonged to the world Strabo glimpsed. If it stood later, under the shadow of Serapis, it belonged to a changed Alexandria, already carrying its losses within it. In either case, the motion was the same, and perhaps that sameness is what history most rarely preserves. So the library passed, not from splendor to nothing, but from one form of keeping into another, and then into memory. Some of its rooms were burned, some were abandoned, some were absorbed into later institutions. Some survive only as topographical arguments, as notes in geographers, as passing remarks in rhetoricians, as archaeology under streets or water. Yet its quiet hours remained legible in the texture of those traces. They spoke of reading after sunset, of ordered abundance, of common meals among scholars, of books arriving from ships, of catalogues long enough to become works themselves, and of an ending measured less by a single flame than by the gradual dimming of a city's oldest lamps. That is where we leave it for tonight. The lanterns are dimming. Sleep well, and we will meet in the next age.